When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, welcome back to the Grease Goblins Rereads channel. Today is a special one for me because, in my opinion, this is really where Clash of Kings starts to get going for me. Some of my favorite chapters come in this sequence of the book, especially the middle part, where we really see the War of the Five Kingdoms start to happen, right? Up to this point, it's been a lot of the planning phases. We've seen a lot of the buildup with Tyrion at King's Landing. We've seen one Catelyn chapter kind of establishing, Robb's whole plot line for this book. We've seen a little bit of Stannis through Davos and Crescent. This is when things start to move. Robb's campaign in the West starts to begin. What's Tywin going to do at Harrenhal? Renly and Stannis' camp as we're introduced into Renly again for the first time since A Game of Thrones. It's a huge chapter, and it's one of my favorites, an iconic chapter, probably one of the best of the entire book in Catelyn 2, A Clash of Kings. So, without further ado, let's get into the chapter, starting on page 252. Catelyn dreamt of a happier time when Bran was whole, Arya and Sansa held hands, and Rickon was still a baby at her breast. This is really important to start because in a lot of ways, Catelyn 1 feels like a lot of the first chapters for this book. It almost feels like an epilogue of what we got in book 1, kind of concluding some of those and reintroducing some of those ideas from book 1 and maybe forwarding the plot a bit. But in my opinion, a lot of the second chapters for a lot of these characters is really where we start to see the focus of where their stories are going. It is weird for Catelyn, who, regardless, throughout the rest of this book will be a massive POV. She's really not in the first third of the book. In the first third of the book, she has one chapter, she's traveling off the page, and we get back to her, and the big part of understanding her as a character is she's valuing her family. She doesn't necessarily care what happens in this war as long as her family is kept safe. She would rather right now have Sansa and Arya back and be back at Winterfell with the rest of her children than have to go through this war where people are dying and her children aren't being returned to her, they're being held hostage, all of those things. And that's really important because as of right now, Catelyn is not at that point where she's super desperate to, get her children back by doing actions that might not seem wise, like right now. Whereas later on, when we start to see things happen with Bran and Rickon, and we see, as time goes on and Arya still has not been found or sighted, and Sansa's situation is growing more and more dire, it's going to switch that. And so I think it's really important that George introduces that right in the first couple sentences of her second chapter. She thinks of Robb without a crown, playing with a wooden sword, and Ned smiling at her from their bed. This was all stuff that occurred just in book 1. It feels like this such a long time has come from like the first couple chapters of book 1 where Robb was, trying how to use a sword, and that whole scuttle with Joffrey and Arya 1. All of that seems like a distant memory at this point. Ned is dead and her children scattered or having to play bigger roles. The dream was sweet, but ended too soon as dawn arrived harshly, waking her to pain and loneliness. It's tough for Catelyn, right? The things that she's being put through, and just being alone, right? She's not with any of her children. Her husband's dead. She's with men that she doesn't really know all that well. It's got to be a very somber feeling for Catelyn. She felt weary of riding, of hurting, of duty, and longed to be comforted, to let go of her strength just for a little while. She wants to be allowed to break down, as any, person should be when they lose a loved one. And the situation that, Catelyn is in, it's a tough one, and she's having to put on this strong face and trying to treat with Renly because she knows it could be the difference of the war ending, very shortly and them being on the winning side, or them being on the losing side and this war being prolonged. Outside, the camp stirred with the sounds of horses and men preparing for the day, and she wished that they would all go away. And this might sound kind of cruel to start with, like what did these men do to her, but it's not that. It's just she wants to be alone. And I think everybody can think about a time where you just want to be alone. I'm somebody that's very much a homebody. I like to be very, I guess, private, but I like to be alone a lot. And so I can definitely understand Catelyn. And Catelyn's just not in that position. She's a lady. She has to have guards around her and all that stuff. And she even says she likes the men around her. They seem good enough men. But she wants to not have to put on the public persona of being strong all the time. She knows that they were loyal, but she yearned for her children instead. She promised herself that one day she would allow herself to be less strong, but not today. She can't. Robb needs her, and, her children back home won't get to see her if this war continues on as it is. Dressing, she found her fingers clumsy and was reminded of the scars left by the Valyrian steel dagger that had nearly taken her hands. Back to that event back in Book 1 on the assassination attempt of Bran. Again, reminding her of her children. It's a constant reminder of what awaits her at Winterfell, and will become even more painful as we see what happens with Theon at Winterfell. But that gets us into page 253. Catelyn emerged from her tent to find Shad stirring oats and Sir Wendon mannerly stringing his bow. Sir Wendon offered to hunt quail for breakfast, but Catelyn declined, insisting oats and bread were sufficient for their long journey. Again, Catelyn doesn't want to have to wait around for these things. We just got done being inside of her head and figuring out what's motivating her. She wants this to be done as quickly as possible, and so she's willing to just eat very basic kind of food. Disappointed but good-natured, Sir Wendell accepted her decision. Shad brewed nettle tea, which Catelyn accepted gratefully, cradling the warm cup in her scarred hands. Robb had 20 of his best men to escort her to Renly, along with 5 noble lordlings to add weight to her mission. Now, I will say it's interesting if you think about Gendry and Arya's party. Their party actually numbered around the same amount of men, but yet they make it through the Riverlands. It's just this difference of, you think about this quality of men being sent with Catelyn's party compared to what Yoren had. It's that difference, right? Where it's there, and this is something that Catelyn is going to talk about, because she took a similar journey getting here that Arya would have taken coming north. Is that, her party is well armored. They're not going to be an easy foe unless you have overwhelming numbers. Bandits won't easily be able to attack them, and so that's why they were kind of unmolested coming south. Catelyn notes that they had traveled cautiously, avoiding towns and holdfasts, and though they saw signs of conflict, no one challenged them. See, they took the opposite approach of Yoren's party. Now, I will say with Catelyn's party, they had more provisions, they had better guards, they didn't necessarily need to go to towns or holdfasts, whereas Arya's party had to forage quite a lot. They didn't have the most amount of supplies. They needed the protection because they don't have good guards. That just shows you the very difference of how just very small things are huge to how you have to travel in this world. With the Blackwater behind them, they had not seen any signs of war for 4 days. It really shows you living in the Riverlands is not fun. You're getting attacked constantly. You're coming into, going down south towards the Stormlands, the Crownlands, towards the Reach, and there seems to be no signs of war whatsoever. Catelyn then thought about how she had protested this mission, telling Robb she did not know Renly, and that she belonged at her dying father's side. And this is the even more hard part for Catelyn, is not only is she, leaving her father, who could die any day now, she's also going the opposite way from her children. So you're in a situation where, out of all of the options that Catelyn possibly could have had, just staying put at Riverrun, going home and going north, she's sent to go further away from them. That's something that Catelyn is really going to struggle with. Robb, who is unable to go himself, of course, Robb can't go unless he brings his whole army there, and if he does that, he might get intercepted by Tywin. He could easily be trapped between the King's Landing forces and then also Tywin. Not a good recipe for success, so Robb has to send some sort of envoy. And who is that going to be? Who can Robb truly trust to deal with Renly? And that's another thing that, Catelyn brings up. She doesn't even know Renly, really, and that's the truth, right? Catelyn does not know Renly. It's not like she has some sort of relationship with him that'll make it to where it'd be easier to maybe negotiate. Maybe if he was an older man that had known Catelyn when she was younger, maybe that'd be a different story, but not Renly. Renly's a young man who's full of a lot of things, as we're going to find out, but somebody that is very rich. He is somebody that can be very arrogant, somebody that Catelyn doesn't really know of yet. Robb had insisted that there was no one else to send. It had to be her. And I do agree. I do think that Robb is right here, that if you're going to send anybody, send Catelyn. Catelyn can be a very good politician, and I actually do think she does a very good job when she goes to meet with Renly. And the other part of it is, you think about a lot of these northern lords. They all are faithfully behind Robb at this point. Robb has not made any of his real mistakes yet. And so he is at the highest of his power. If he sends somebody like the Great John Umber or Lord Karstark, a lot of these people might not have the right touch of negotiation. You think about how stubborn the Northmen can be. Catelyn is much different. Catelyn is a southern lady. She knows a bit more how to interact with lords and things like that from the south. And so I think it really makes a lot of sense, because Catelyn, one, has the full trust of Robb, and also she is somebody that I think would handle somebody like Renly better than a lot of these other Northern Lords would, and that's something that Robb's going to use against Catelyn as well. Robb had revealed his plans to march, which had caught Catelyn by surprise as no one had informed her. But I find this to be funny because in Catelyn 1, George R. R. Martin really gives us pretty much a glimpse of what we're going to see. Robb is going to go west. That's what the Blackfish and Catelyn kind of discuss. It does kind of seem a little odd that Catelyn doesn't kind of figure out that, yeah, Robb's probably going to listen to Brynden, right? He is the eyes of Robb's party, more or less. And that's another thing, right? You might be thinking, well, maybe he should have sent the Blackfish to deal with Renly. And I almost think it's kind of the same as sending a Northman. The Blackfish is a lot like the Northman, very stubborn. You think about how he holds River Run against the Freys. It's very like Northman-like. So again, one, you can't send the Blackfish because he is Robb's top, military general. He's going to need him in the West. And two, when you also think about this, he's not the right personality to maybe deal with somebody like a Renly. So that's another thing to kind of point out there. But it should kind of be clicking in Catelyn's mind that, yeah, Robb is going to go west. Robb had argued that staying idle made him look weak, and that even his Northmen were growing restless. And Robb is completely right. These men believed they were going south to either, one, save Ned. Well, Ned's dead, so now it's more about revenge. It's more about vengeance, something that we'll see with Lord Karstark later on. A lot of these men that were probably marching south never thought that they would come home. That's something we see, quite a lot during things like the dance or something like that. These men are going to grow restless just sitting around and waiting. And Robb is completely right. He cannot stay at River Run forever. And Catelyn doesn't really get his plan right away. Catelyn warned him of the dangers of rashness, urging patience because she thought that Robb meant to go attack Harrenhal. But Robb was unconvinced. He doubted Lysa's support, frustrated by her silence despite the birds he had sent, and feared his army would dissolve if he did not act. And he's 100% correct. Think about the River Lords. The River Lords are already going to their own lands to try and defend it from the Lannister forces. You also think about, Lysa is not going to help you. Catelyn's last interaction with Lysa should have told you all you needed to know. Lysa wasn't coming to their aid. If she was, they would already have gotten messages back, an army would be forming. None of that's happening. And so Robb is completely right. From a military aspect, he's 100% correct. They need to do something. They cannot wait. And that'll get us into page 254. Catelyn challenged Robb, accusing him of playing into Tywin Lannister's hands, but Robb avoided the topic of Harrenhal, instead pressed her to go to Renly. Robb's not dumb. If Robb was to go to Harrenhal, it would be very stupid. It would be something that he could not win, or maybe if he did, he would take heavy losses. His campaign would be very much damaged. He just does not have the power to try and take Harrenhal because of how great of a defensible position it is. Tywin's very smart to take Harrenhal. You think about Daemon. What does he do in the dance? The first thing he does is he takes Harrenhal because of it's a great place to rally your men. It can supply huge numbers of men. It's a centralized location, allowing for a lot of flexibility to attack here and there or just defend, distract your enemies. It's a great place. That's why during all these wars, Harrenhal is always seen as a very influential and important place on the map. It's also, as a side note, why it switches hands so many times. Plus, it might be cursed, so who knows. But Robb then played his trump card. He cleverly hinted at sending Great Jon Umber instead, knowing Catelyn would see how unsuitable that would be. The Great Jon is quite literally the worst person you could possibly send to Renly. That would not go well, and Catelyn knows it. Understanding she had little choice, she agreed, hoping her father would survive until her return. Her farewell to her father was painful. He mistook her for her mother and called for his daughters as if they were still children. Again, we talked about this a lot in not only Catelyn 1 of this book, but also in the last chapter of Catelyn for Game of Thrones. Dementia is a very horrible thing, and you really see that through, Hoster Tully and his declining physical and mental health. It's something that's really damaging for Catelyn, just another layer of adding to her emotional state, where not only is her father dying, he doesn't even really seem to remember who she is to begin with. She assured him his babes were well and asked him to wait for her just as she had waited for him many times before, and other things like maybe the War of the Ninepenny Kings or Robert's Rebellion or things like that. when battle or war calls, the Greyjoy Rebellion, if you want to go that far as well. As she drank her tea, she lamented that fate always seemed to drive her south when her heart longed to go north to her sons. It's really unfortunate because Catelyn is in a tough position. Does she force her way to go back home? Well, if she does that, who's going to treat with Renly? And it's one of those things where we're going to get to a point where Catelyn should have probably gone home, and she doesn't. And that's going to be the interesting part. We're going to get to a point of the story when Catelyn, is heading back to Riverrun. Maybe she should have gone back to the north. Now, it wouldn't have worked out that way just because we know the Greyjoys take over the north. She wouldn't have never made it back, but it is something that she thinks about quite often. It's really interesting to think about if Catelyn had actually gone back to Winterfell earlier. Could she have advised or run, the north and Winterfell better in a way that, again, Theon wouldn't have been able to take Winterfell? Maybe, it definitely could have worked out that way. Would she have dealt with the Lady Hornwood situation differently? There's a lot there I think that's very interesting to think about. She had written to Bran and Rickon before leaving Riverrun, reassuring them that she had not forgotten them, though Robb's needs had to come first. Which is true. Robb's in the middle of war. If you're Catelyn, you're thinking Rickon and Bran are safe. They are in the safest place they could possibly be right now. Winterfell. It's deep in the north, the heart of the north. No one's going to bother them or do anything like that. Or else it would seem nobody would really see the Greyjoys betraying them, or I guess at least betraying them to the extent of invading the north because of how idiotic that is. Sir Wendell noted they would likely reach the Upper Mander that day and that Renly's camp was close. Catelyn dreaded the meeting, knowing Robb would never accept Renly as king, and they needed allies, not more enemies. Catelyn knew that this is a tough situation because, on one hand, you can't sit here and go, okay, Robb is going to bend the knee, he's going to give up his crown. The Northmen would never go for that. So what Catelyn is trying to do is she's trying to get an alliance with Renly, but at the same time, also not giving Renly what he wants. Renly's going to want the North to bend the knee and to, fill him in as the new king, right? That's something that she knows Robb would never do. And so how do you make an alliance with Renly? Because it's more likely things could go bad than good. She finished her meal absent-mindedly and urged the group to move, eager to complete her mission and return home. She rode at the front, setting the pace, while Hal Mullen bore the Stark banner beside her. It's a lot of that anxious feeling, her wanting this to be over, and I relate a lot to it because I'm also very similar to that. I am someone that does get kind of anxious when I have to do things like, say, a group project and I have to do a presentation. I want that thing to be over with as soon as possible so I can get rid of that feeling, right? I can do whatever I want to do now, right? So I really do relate a lot to Catelyn and her thoughts there. A half day from Renly's camp, their scout, Robin Flint, returned with news of a watcher in a distant windmill. By the time they reached the mill, the man had vanished, and soon after, they were intercepted by Renly's outriders. 20 mailed and mounted men surrounded them, led by a grizzled knight with blue jays on his surcoat. The knight introduced himself as Sir Cullen of Greenpools, rode up alone and warned Catelyn that the lands they crossed were dangerous. Which, not really. At this point, there isn't really much war happening where Renly is, right? So it's more like, okay, if you are against Renly, yeah, this could be a very, dangerous road, but at this point, not particularly. The dangerous roads are behind Catelyn and her party, so Sir Cullen, you kind of come off as a little ignorant given the fact that they just went through the Riverlands. But we'll give it to him, right? Maybe there's still more, crimes happening because of the war breaking out and stuff like that, but still, it kind of comes off as like Renly's camp in the coming pages really feels like they're oblivious to what's happening in the rest of the world. And this is kind of like that introduction to it. It's like, you think this is dangerous? You haven't seen anything yet, right? Playing at war, Catelyn, we'll say later on. But that gets us into page 255. Catelyn informs Sir Cullen that they came as an envoy from Robb Stark, the king in the north, to treat with Renly Baratheon. Sir Cullen, while courteous, insisted that Renly was the rightful king of all the 7 kingdoms. Again, a prelude to what Catelyn's going to face. Catelyn is representing somebody that is a king, who is somebody independent, something that has not been seen in Westeros for 300 years, that have not been part of the kingdoms. Now, again, the Starks were independent themselves for thousands of years, but it's very different here. And they're going to insist upon Renly being the king. So how is Catelyn going to handle that situation? Just some of the things she's going to have to deal with. Sir Cullen informed her that Renly's camp was near Bitterbridge and offered to escort her there. As his men flanked her party in a double column, Catelyn wondered whether they were escorts or captors, but had no choice but to trust in Sir Cullen's honor. And to answer that question, they're a bit of both. One, you're not going to let Catelyn just go free, right? She could be spying on Renly's camp or whatever. And also, you do want to see what this alliance could be. Could the Starks help Renly? That would really help the war effort. This is a really interesting meeting. An hour away from the river, they saw smoke rising from Renly's campfires. As they rode closer, they heard the growing sounds of men, steel, and horses, resembling the murmur of a distant sea. Think about this. In Renly's forces, there's estimated to be like anywhere from like 80,000 to 100,000, maybe more than that, 120,000, anywhere from that range of men. That is 4 to 6 times larger than Robb's whole army combined. Think about that. Regardless of the quality of men, if you want to say they're untested, they're summer knights or whatever, you want to say, still, this is a lot of people. Can you think about this for a moment? Go to any open, large field that you can think of and put 100 to 100 and maybe 20,000 men there who are, working with weapons and siege equipment and horses. Again, thousands of horses. And that's just the men. Think about the squires. Think about the serving women, the pleasure women, we'll say. Think about all of those people. This is just a horde of people. And that's going to be something that really is going to back Renly's claim, is he has the power and the means to take the throne. When they reached the Mander, the full scale of Renly's host became clear. Thousands of cook fires sent pale smoke into the air, and the horse line stretched for literal leagues. You basically could not see the end of their horse lines. That is insane. Like, this is one of the largest armies ever put on Westeros. Like, that again, I want you to think about that, because when we get into, especially with Renly and Stannis, you've really got to take that into account and go, does Renly have an argument here? He has so much support. Like, his army and the people here are larger than the entire population of the North. Like, that's just crazy to think about. Catelyn also sees enormous siege engines and other things like steel tips of countless pikes. Again, there's a lot going on here. And also, you think about this, is that there's actually a tournament going on, which is really weird. You think about the North and how, they are very kind of hardened and caring about serious stuff. This is kind of the opposite. Catelyn sees knights' pavilions dotted in the grass, while men armed with spears, swords, and bows bustled throughout the camp. Camp followers, squires, pages, teamsters, and swineherds filled the space with constant movement and noise. Even think about their supply lines. Think about the food that they're taking with them, all these supplies. I mean, it's just a incredible thing to picture in your mind. And of course, in the show, we didn't necessarily get to see all of that, because that's just, it'd be super difficult to put that to screen, especially with the budget of the early seasons of Game of Thrones. But it's just remarkable. It shows the splendor, the richness of the South, especially the Tyrells. Sir Wendell Manderly remarked on the size and strength of the host, and Catelyn agreed. Nearly all the chivalry of the South had gathered under Renly's banner. The golden rose of House Tyrell was the most prominent sigil, appearing on soldiers, banners, and shields. Other banners included House Florence, Fox, and Flowers, which is interesting, given the Florence are also supporting Stannis, but not all of them. Fossaway apples, Tarley striding huntsmen, Oakhart's oak leaves, cranes, very original, and the black and orange butterflies of House Mullendor as we get into page 256. Again, shows the sheer support that Renly has. Across the Mander, Renly Stormlords had raised their banners. Lords sworn House Baratheon and Storm's End. Catelyn recognized banners such as Bryce Caron's Nightingales, the Penrose Quills, and Lord Estermont's Sea Turtle. Again, just a lot of lords. Many unfamiliar shields are present as well, belonging to minor lords, hedge knights, and free riders who had come to support Renly's claim. Renly has such a large host, you're going to have just people that are going to follow. I mean, think about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the Dunk and Egg novellas. This would have been a perfect situation for someone like in Dunk's position, right? Get into this camp where maybe you can get accepted into a lords and knights or groups of men. Give yourself somewhere with meals and things like that. This is kind of, what the first Blackfire rebellion would have represented for like Sir Eustace, right? It's the same kind of idea. Renly's personal banner flew above all others from the tallest siege tower, a massive golden cloth with the crowned black stag of Baratheon. Hallis Mullen rode close to Catelyn and asked her about the noise ahead. This wasn't any normal noise of a camp going to war. She listened and identified shouts, horses screaming, clashing steel, and cheering. As they crested a gentle slope, they saw a gathering of bright pavilions and a dense press of men. You would think, in a time of war, you would need every man to be as healthy as possible, but no, there are men in tourneys that are possibly getting injured, and they're playing at war, something that will go very differently from what the North is accustomed to and what we really saw in Book 1 with Robb's campaign. Below, near the battlements of a small castle, a melee was taking place. The field was littered with broken lances and armor scraps, evidence of combat over the past day or more. This isn't just a one-day thing. This has been happening for multiple days, something similar to what we see in the first Dunk and Egg novella. Less than 20 knights remained in the fight, charging and striking each other as the crowd cheered. 2 destriers in full armor collided and crashed to the ground in a tangle of steel and horse flesh. Hal Mullen loudly announced that it was a tourney. A little obvious, Hal. Yeah, no duh. Sir Wendell manually watched as a knight in a rainbow-striped cloak shattered an opponent's shield with a long-handled axe. The dense crowd sloped their progress, making movements difficult. Now, something I want to point out right away with the rainbow-striped cloak of Renly's Kingsguard is it's very different, and I think it has a number of reasons. I think the more obvious one, obviously, is you think about LGBTQ, their flag is kind of like a rainbow-colored flag, and so maybe that's to reflect Renly himself, who we believe was either bisexual or gay. So there's maybe that representation, but I think it goes a lot deeper than that. I think there's more to it than that, just that. You think about Renly himself. He's somebody that likes pleasantries. He likes bright colors. He is somebody that cares a lot about the material than the deeds side of things, right? If you look at Renly and Stannis, what makes their conflict so interesting is they're 2 characters on opposite sides of the argument, right? Where you have Stannis, who doesn't really care about material things at all. He dresses very plainly and things like that. He, lived on Dragonstone for the last few years. I mean, somewhere that's very dark. And, also King's Landing. But again, his home that he's ruling over is Dragonstone, a very dark place. Storm's End, Renly is kind of liking all the bright colors. He's in bed with the Tyrells known for their pleasantries, the material. They have all of the wealth of Highgarden. It's a lot further than I think just the surface level of what we kind of associate with the Rainbow Guard, or maybe what somebody on a first read might think about with the Rainbow Cloaks. Sir Cullen requested that Catelyn's men remain behind while he escorted her to Renly. Catelyn commanded her men to wait and followed Sir Cullen through the throng. A roar erupted as a red-bearded knight with a griffin on his shield fell before a large knight in deep blue armor. We know this to be Brienne, and we know this other knight to be Red Ronnet Connington, someone that kind of an ass, but, we'll get there when we get there. Victorious knight's armor and morning star were a striking cobalt hue, and his horse was barded in the quartered sun and moon heraldry of House Tarth. Getting into page 257, a man cursed that the Red Ronnet had fallen. Another muttered about Loras before a roar from the crowd drowned out his words. Another knight fell, trapped beneath his wounded, screaming horse as squires rushed to help. You see this? This is the whole thing. You're at war, and you're having men get injured and horses dying or whatever in a joust. You think about how insane that is when you think about what's going on in the Riverlands. You think about that. If Renly was a man who cared truly and deeply about the people, and that was his main motivation, he kind of puts on to the people, don't you think that he would be rushing to try and free the Riverlands from the awful Lannisters and all that stuff? It really is a nice reflection of what we've seen through Arya's eyes, that you have things going on like this. And the hypocrisy of it all. Catelyn thought it was madness. Real enemies surrounded them. The realm burned, yet Renly played at war like a child. And Catelyn isn't wrong, but I also do think Renly is quite smart. Even though I think that the moral and ethical decision here is not, the best for Renly. Smart-wise, you let your enemies bleed themselves while you sit back and sweep in and take the victory. It's not a bad plan by Renly. The lords and ladies in the gallery were engrossed in the melee. In the melee, Catelyn recognized several southern lords from her father's dealings, including Lord Mathis Rowan, now stouter and more florid, his white doublet embroidered with his house's golden tree, Lady Oakhart, small and delicate, Lord Randall Tarley of Hornhill, his great sword Heartsbane resting behind his seat. She recognized some sigils, but many remained unfamiliar. Catelyn, albeit from the south, she's not from the Reach. Now, she would recognize people, of course, but she's not going to recognize all these people, maybe sons or daughters that have taken over after their parents have died. At the center, laughing with his young queen, sat Renly Baratheon, a ghost in a golden crown. Something that I think the show did a decent job of because, again, the problem you have to have when you're casting the character of Renly is he has to look like a lot like a young Robert Baratheon. And so it's hard because in the show, you're going off of Mark Addy's appearance and the older version of Robert Baratheon. And so I actually do think in the show they did a pretty good job casting of Renly because Renly in a lot of ways based off of Mark Addy's appearance is kind of what I would have thought Robert Baratheon would have looked like younger based off the television show. But it's made very apparent in the books that Renly looks exactly like Robert. And if you don't think that plays into why the Stormlands love him so much, you are mistaken. Robert was loved by the Stormlands. He was somebody who was able to turn enemies to friends very easily. Something that Stannis is really jealous of, and because both of his brothers are able to do that very easily. And so you have a lot of that, where Renly is the king that people like because he looks like Robert. He's more kind and friendly and generous. He has the backing of the Tyrells. He looks the part of a king, where Stannis doesn't have that luxury. Catelyn noted how Renly resembled Robert in his youth, tall, broad-shouldered, with coal-black hair, deep blue eyes, and an easy smile. It also is something that's interesting is you think about Robert's children, here's Renly, the exact match of Robert when he was younger, and nobody seemed, or at least none of the public, noticed Robert's children didn't look anything like him. Now, I am of the mind that Renly knows that Robert's children weren't his, but he chose to act differently than others because, again, Robert's children not being Robert's is weird for Renly because if Renly wants to become king, if he's being persuaded to be king by people like Loras and the Tyrells, well, again, all of his children being bastards doesn't actually mean all that much because Renly, if you go by the traditional ideas of rulership, it still makes it to where Renly is not the person that should become king. It would be Stannis. And so Renly, the way he's doing it is by popularity and also by the opportunity to do it, right? The kingdoms are divided. They're looking for a new king. People are not backing Stannis. You have things coming out about Joffrey and the Lannister kids. And so Renly is taking the opportunity to seize the throne by conquest and a little bit off of, I guess, his heraldry as well. Catelyn thinks that his crown suited him, a delicate ring of golden roses with a dark green jade stag's head at the front, set with golden eyes and antlers. Something I've always puzzled me is how come out of all of the kings during this point, Renly is really the only king that we see with a crown in the show. I always found that really odd to me. And I love his crown in the show, by the way. His crown is really good. It's really awesome. And I've always liked Renly's crown. I think it's been one of my favorites. But yeah, it just shows what Renly values, the materialism of his campaign. His green velvet tunic bore the crowned stag of House Baratheon, embroidered in gold in the colors of Highgarden. Beside him sat his young queen, Margaery Tyrell, the daughter of Lord Mace Tyrell. Catelyn understood that their marriage was the foundation of the Great Southern Alliance. Of course, you've got to marry another great house to get their support. Catelyn understands this really well, as she was basically a chip that would combine the Tully forces with the North. Renly was 21 and Margaery no older than Robb, but she was a pretty girl with soft doe-like eyes and long brown curls. Who does that remind you of? I'm just saying, right? If you think about the way that Alicent Hightower is described in the show in House of the Dragon, Margaery has almost that exact same kind of description. And it makes sense given the fact that Margaery is part Hightower. So, just a nice little tidbit I wanted to throw in there for you guys. Catelyn does note that Margaery's smile was shy and sweet, and on the field another knight fell to the one in the rainbow-striped cloak, who we know is Loras. The crowd, including Renly, roared with approval. Renly called out, "Loras, Loras, Highgarden," and Margaery clapped her hands in delight. That gets us to page 258. Catelyn turned to witness the final moments of the melee. Only 4 men remained in the fight, and the crowd's favorite was obvious. Loras Tyrell. Everybody loves Loras. He is basically the Aemon, the Dragon Knight of this era in terms of popularity. And maybe, I wouldn't say as good as Aemon in terms of prowess, but that's kind of what people project him to be like. Though she had never met Sir Loras Tyrell, even in the north, his skill was legendary. I think that's a really interesting, note. And we talk about, for instance, I talk about this a lot with characters like Arthur Dayne and how well known they would have been in the north. And I know this isn't talking about physical description, but something that I really want to put out there is even in the north, they know about Loras Tyrell. Loras Tyrell is still very young. He hasn't been competing in jousts and things like that for very long at all. And already the north has heard about him. So I just want to throw that out there about characters like Arthur Dayne and Barristan that I think is very fascinating. It's how well those tales would spread. So Loras rode a tall white stallion, wore silver mail, and wielded a long-handled axe. His helm bore a crest of golden roses, and 2 of the remaining combatants allied against the knight in cobalt armor. As they attacked from both sides, the Blue Knight reacted swiftly. Brienne smashed one opponent in the face with her broken shield. Sorry, it's hard to keep my notes straight because Catelyn at this point believes that Brienne is a man, but we as the audience know, I guess on our reread, this is not Brienne. So if you hear me calling Brienne a he or whatever, that's why. It's hard because I have my notes. Yeah. Brienne's horse then kicked the second attacker with a steel-shod hoof. One man was unhorsed, the other left reeling. Brienne dropped her shattered shield to free her left arm. Sir Loras charged Brienne, moving with grace despite the weight of her armor. Their horses circled each other like dancers at a harvest festival, exchanging blows instead of kisses. The battle between Longaxe and Morningstar created a deafening clangor. The Blue Knight, now shieldless, struggled under Sir Loras's relentless attacks. It seemed like Sir Loras was getting the better of Brienne for now. Sir Loras intercepted the Morningstar's strike with his battered green shield bearing 3 golden roses. A final swing of the long axe struck the Blue Knight's hand, sending her Morning Star flying. This seemed to be the end. Loras had disarmed Brienne, but that would not be the end of it, as we know. The crowd roared in excitement as Sir Loras raised his axe for the finishing blow. Instead of yielding, the Blue Knight charged headlong into the strike, taking the blow. Their stallions collided violently. The axe smashed against the Blue Knight's breastplate, but she seized the haft and wrenched it from Loras's grip. The fight turned into a grappling match as they fell from their horses. They crashed to the ground, with Loras taking the worst of the fall. The Blue Knight drew a dirk and flipped open Loras's visor, signaling the end of the fight. Though the crowd's roar drowned out the words, Catelyn saw Loras's lips form the word yield. The Blue Knight, unsteady, climbed to her feet and saluted Renly with her dirk. The squires rushed to aid Loras as the shock throughout the audience rippled. No one had expected Brienne to win, and especially not against Loras. When they removed Loras's helm, Catelyn was surprised by his youth. He was barely older than Robb. Again, Loras is a very young guy, right? He's somebody that's gotten all this reputation and renown, and he's only around Robb's age. It's crazy to think about that. Though he might have been as handsome as his sister, his split lip, unfocused eyes, and blood-matted hair obscured his beauty. Even Catelyn can tell this is a really good-looking guy, even with his, again, issues going on of this fight that just happened. That gets us to page 259. Renly summoned the Blue Knight, whose battered armor and tattered cloak showed the toll of battle, how hardcore this was. Some began to mock Brienne, calling her a beauty, while others stayed silent. Kneeling, the knight addressed Renly as Grace. Renly praised her, remarking on Sir Loras's defeat. A drunken archer dismissed it as a vile trick. Again, we really are getting into how women are viewed, especially in terms of being not traditional, right? We just got done talking about Marjorie and how she's kind of this traditional woman and all this stuff. And here's Brienne. Brienne just won a tournament with, again, some of the most amount of knights in the entire land, right? She just beat Loras, somebody even the North knows about. That is crazy to think about, and Brienne is going to get a pretty good reward. Catelyn asked Sir Cullen about the knight's identity, and he revealed that the knight was Brienne of Tarth, mockingly calling her Brienne the Beauty. Renly declared her the champion of the Bitter Bridge melee, which had 116 knights participate, and some of the best. She requested a place in Renly's Rainbow Guard, and Renly granted it. This is really interesting because we're already talking about how Renly is kind of progressive. He's kind of doing things very differently than you normally would see, especially his claim and things like that. And now he's putting a woman on the King's Guard. We haven't seen a woman be really this high up in the King's service since the days of really Jaehaerys's reign. And so this is something that people are very much going to question. But because Renly is so well loved, and again, his cause looks like it's going to win at this point, people are going to just kind of grumble, but they aren't going to really say anything about it. It kind of just comes off as Renly being a good man, a good person, and somebody that cared about his followers and things like that. Upon removing her helm, Catelyn saw her unkempt, straw-colored hair and coarse features. And we're going to get, and in my opinion, two of the most, I would say, iconic quotes of this book and of the series. Because this is a line that really sticks with you because it really shows how women are valued in this society. Because pity filled Catelyn's heart. She thinks, is there any creature on earth as unfortunate as an ugly woman? And I want to point that question here because think about the way women are valued in this world. Women are valued for how beautiful they are. If you're lucky, if you're like a highborn lady, even if maybe you're not as attractive, you'll still have, somebody that you can marry. But if you're, common born or you're something like this and you're ugly, you're just devalued in the society. And this is still something that again is still like plaguing our own society now. There's the idea of like pretty privilege, for instance, people treating you better because you look better. It is an idea that is still being tossed around now. And so, think about back then, right? Think about anything that you may think about attractiveness and how that works into it. Put that into a medieval society where already there's not equality. Women are not treated equal to men. And then you take away that Brienne, which most people view women in society as their main role is to produce children, and Brienne is not the most attractive person to a lot of people. It really is it's a tough statement, right? Because Catelyn is right. Like, she is 100% right in her statement that she's thinking, but it's still a very harsh statement. That gets us into page 260. Renly replaced Brienne's torn cloak with a rainbow one, and her face lit up as she swore, "My life for yours, your grace." Her admiration for Renly was painfully evident. Even Catelyn can see that Brienne's basically in love with Renly, and it's really unfortunate because we know Renly ain't interested. And also, you think about what Brienne has just signed up for. Brienne has just signed up that she's not going to have children. She's not going to have any love interest. So it's really a very painful thing that kind of Catelyn is seeing. It kind of reminds you for maybe one of your friends had like a crush on this girl that you knew was not interested in him at all. It's kind of what Catelyn is seeing right here. Sir Colin introduced Catelyn as an envoy of Robb, and Renly welcomed her warmly, and Queen Marjorie Tyrell offered condolences for Ned's death. Renly vowed to bring Cersei's head to her when he took King's Landing. And Catelyn, again, she doesn't care about those things. Catelyn is not somebody that's vying for revenge. Catelyn is vying for getting her family back. And so things like this don't necessarily motivate her. Yes, she would, maybe like for Cersei to be killed for her actions, but it's not something that's going to motivate her. And so that's something right away that's kind of different. And again, it's just pointing out what Catelyn is struggling with her family. Catelyn remained reserved, saying justice would be enough. Brienne insisted she address Renly as your grace, but Catelyn dismissed the debate, focusing on more pressing matters. Again, Catelyn does a really good job of just kind of getting away and diffusing this situation, because getting into a debate about whether Renly's a king or Robb's a king is a slippery slope and will get you down to a conversation that's not going to lead anywhere. Renly, amused, asked about Robb's plan for Harrenhal, but Catelyn withheld that information. She doesn't want to tell Renly what Robb's doing. They're not even allies yet. Why would she tell him something like that? And so Catelyn is really smart to diffuse that and kind of not say anything about that, just saying, I'm not on his war councils and all that kind of stuff. They go a bit further, asking about Jaime Lannister as he had been captured by Robb in the last book, and wondering if he was still alive. As Catelyn tells them that yes, he is still alive and at Riverrun. Mathis Rowan was disappointed by this. Renly jests that the wolves are a bit more gentler than the lions, as, of course, Ned was killed by the lions, and Jaime, well, he's just being held as a prisoner. And even Lady Oakheart scoffed at this as well. Again, it's really weird because you think about Robb's position, killing Jaime does nothing for them. Like, it does nothing for them. Maybe it gets some of their bloodlust, all that stuff, but killing Jaime is just, that's blatantly killing Sansa. That's more or less what that is. It's something that makes no sense. Again, it just shows the Southern, lords and ladies playing at war, not understanding, what it's like to maybe lose their families and things like that. Even think about the Tyrells and the Reach as a whole. That really portion of the country hasn't had much conflict and wars at all in the last really 50 years. So just kind of shows you the different views of the world and the way different cultures. Getting to page 261, Lord Randall Tarly criticized Robb for not paying homage to King Renly in person, implying weakness by hiding behind his mother, which is so ignorant, and Randall Tarly is not a pleasant man. He is somebody that is not very likable, as we learned in Book 1 through Samwell, and Catelyn gives her best Ned Stark impersonation. She responds coldly, explaining Robb is at war, not playing at one, and attending tournaments. Again, there are so many iconic lines from Catelyn in this chapter, just another one that I love from her. Renly smiles and advises Lord Randall to be careful, then arranges for Catelyn's companions to be taken care of and offers her his own pavilion. As he is not staying in it, he's currently staying at the castle that they are currently at. Renly invites Catelyn to join him for a farewell feast at Lord Caswell's castle, joking about Caswell's eagerness to see him go. And who wouldn't want them to go, right? Renly has a host that you cannot feed. It's going to go through all of your winter supplies. It is just, you cannot stay in one place long. This horde has to go one way or the other. Now, Lord Caswell tries to kind of joke about this, saying that that's not the case, that his hospitality is genuine, which I do believe to a degree it probably is, but at the same time, deep down he knows he needs Renly to move on. But Renly makes a joke about Robert. If you had said that to Robert, Robert may have done even further, maybe even taking some of his daughters to bed and making some bastards. Renly helps his bride, Marjorie, up and leads her back to the castle, leaving Catelyn to settle in the king's pavilion. And this is what I think is even crazier. You think about this, they're marching to war, and this is the way Catelyn describes his pavilion. His pavilion is lavishly furnished, with every comfort provided, including a feather mattress, a large wooden copper tub, fine food, wine, and various entertainment items like books, maps, and weapons. You're at war. And this is how nicely Renly is quite literally on the road going toward living better than about 99% of the population. That's crazy. That is crazy. If that doesn't show who Renly is as a person and kind of his motivations and things like that, I don't know what else you need. A lot of this chapter really is focusing on developing Renly as a character and setting up that conflict with Stannis, which I really love. It's, again, for me, it's the best chapter of this book is the next Catelyn chapter. But this really goes to kind of show what's kind of going on. And Catelyn even realizes this makes so much sense now. Why Renly is moving so slowly. She's realizing what motivates him as we get into page 262. Catelyn notices the king's armor beside the entrance, admiring its polished sheen, but feeling unsettled by her reflection. Very interesting that she thinks about this, because if you think about this armor and the way she's kind of looking at it in her reflection, it's also going to be almost a foreshadowing of Renly's inevitable death. So I do like that little kind of nod to that, because even think about what she sees in this reflection. She sees the face of a drowned woman. She feels anger towards her own weakness and decides she has no time for self-pity. She sees a version of herself. Maybe that's the Catelyn version of herself that's going to come out, later on in the series. But I almost feel like it's this idea of a shade, like Stannis' shade, that other part of Stannis coming to kill, a part of maybe his soul to kill his brother Renly. I love the little tiny little bits of foreshadowing here that foreshadow that event to come with Renly's death. Catelyn is accompanied by Sir Wendell Manderly, Lucas Blackwood, Sir Perwyn Frey, and other highborn companions to Lord Caswell's keep. In the crowded Great Hall, Catelyn is seated on the dais between Lord Mathis Rowan and Sir John Fossaway, where they engage in polite conversation. Brienne of Tarth also sits at the far end of the high table, wearing knight's attire, which she prefers to womanly attire, something that, again, it is weird because it almost makes her even more of a target. It makes her stand out even more. And Catelyn even notes, kind of highlights Unfortunately, her plainness and physical awkwardness. She is clearly uncomfortable with her appearance and speaking little and focused on her food. And can you blame Brienne? Right? People constantly bullying her for her appearance, the way she looks, the way she acts. She's someone that is also extremely young. This is something that the show didn't do a great representation of, but Brienne is very young at this point, right? She's somebody that is still working through who she's going to be as a person. And when you factor that in with being extremely bullied by the people around her, it's a tough situation that Brienne is in. The feast is lavish with an abundance of food from Highgarden. The meal includes poached pears, savory fish, stuffed capons, bread, turnips, sweet corn, hams, roast geese, venison stew, and a variety of pastries and sweets. Catelyn, if I was Catelyn, I couldn't help but think the Riverlands are starving to death right now. King's Landing is starving. And here they're having this feast amidst a war. Again, it's pointing to the exact idea we've been getting the whole chapter. Catelyn even herself feels queasy from the rich food, but hides her discomfort, knowing she must remain strong. She watches Renly, who is seated with his bride and her brother, Sir Loras. She even seems to pick up that Renly seems to be more affectionate or attentive to Sir Loras. Sir Loras seems unaffected by the day's events, looking comely with lively eyes and unkempt brown hair. He wears a new tourney cloak adorned with the rainbow guard stripes and golden rose of Highgarden. Again, as we're getting into page 263, Catelyn seems that this is very peculiar. That Renly, yes, he does pay attention to Marjorie feeding her morsels from his dagger, but for the most part, he shares his jests and confidences with Sir Loras. All the while, though, Renly plays the honorable, good king. He remains lighthearted, and yes, he does seem to enjoy his food and drink, but he doesn't do it in excess. He isn't doing what Robert was doing when we come into the normal story. He's somebody that knows how to enjoy himself, have a good time, but not overdo it. And that's what would make Renly a very likable king to a lot of people. He looks exactly like Robert, but he doesn't maybe have the negative sides that Robert does. He has some negative sides of his own, but maybe not exactly Robert's issues. Some of the guests, however, are less restrained, drinking too much and boasting loudly. Lord Willem's sons argue about who will reach King's Landing first. Lord Varnar fondles a serving girl, and Gaiard the Green sings a nonsensical verse about lions. Again, it's just these people that are dreaming about war and all these things, which isn't uncommon, right? We see this even in today's world about how people were being recruited and propaganda about enlisting into World War I or World War II or all these different things. And that's going to play out exactly into George R.R. Martin's writing, especially with the Vietnam War and how that influenced his writing. It's toast to that. And when we get to Catelyn's famous line, which we're coming up on, it really kind of fits that all perfectly. These people are very similar to Sansa in their worldviews and how they think about war and things like that. Sir Mark Mullendore entertains with a monkey, and Sir Tanton of the Fossaways drunkenly vows to slay Sandor Clegane, making the vow less serious due to his antics. Now, Clegane would absolutely destroy Sir Tanton, and so that was a really bad thing to swear or vow. But, a lot of these men are probably going to die, so that's just how it's going to be. It just tells you how drunk on honor and all these things and trying to get glory that they are really on. The foolishness peaks when a fool in gold-painted tin chases a dwarf, hitting him with a bladder. The fool claims to be a kinslayer, to which Renly corrects him, and the hall bursts into laughter. Lord Rowan observes the youth of their revelers, noting that they are all much younger than the generation that fought in Robert's Rebellion and subsequent wars. The whole point of this is, these men have never experienced what war is like. They don't know what it's about. They weren't there during Robert's Rebellion. They weren't really fighting in the Greyjoy Rebellion. They don't really know any of those things. Catelyn reflects on their naivety, thinking they are still unblooded and see war as a game, full of dreams of glory and spoils, with no sense of morality. Agreed. They don't understand the complexities of war. They don't know what it does to people because they've never experienced it. They're hearing all of these things happening. They're like, oh, these are all grand battles and things like that. They're not. It's the loss of human life. It's looting and desperation. And it really is kind of the worst parts of humanity, of war, and what it does to people. That's really what a lot of this story is about. Catelyn shares her pity for them, believing war will age them quickly, just as it did her generation, which is completely true. Think about how quickly Ned had to grow up. Think about how quickly Catelyn had to grow up. Think about how quickly Robert had to grow up, and Stannis. War changes people, and you may not even live to see that, right? You might not live to see yourself become older. You may die quite young, like a lot of people did during, the last major war in Robert's Rebellion. Lord Rowan questions why she pities them, noting their vitality, youth, strength, and lust, believing they are living the best years with no concern for the future. And again, this is something that a lot of people always say, right? When you're in your 20s, enjoy life. That's, your best times or whatever. But it's a bit different here when you're marching to war. And so, maybe on a normal circumstance during peace times, I might agree with Lord Rowan, live your best life. But here it's different. And this is kind of where we get, I would say, probably one of the most iconic lines of not only the book, but also of the entire series. We get into page 264. As Catelyn responds with this. She states that the nights of summer will not last and winter is coming. Again, this all isn't going to stay sunshine and rainbows. When that war happens and it hits these men, it's not going to be the same. When they see their friends dying, their family members dying, it will change them. Brienne disagrees with Catelyn's sentiment, believing that knights will always be remembered in songs where they are gallant and immortal, and the sun always shines. Who does this sound like? I'll give you a guess. We've talked about her a lot in this chapter already and even in past chapters. Sansa. Sansa thinks the exact same things. She thinks all these things about war. And again, a lot of her stories about kind of going away from that. And Brienne is also on that same journey. Now, Brienne and Sansa are vastly different characters, but they share some of these same things of innocence and not understanding the world. Catelyn reflects on the inevitability of winter for everyone, feeling it personally since Ned's death, but she doesn't voice it to Brienne. Catelyn doesn't want to be this person in this sea of happiness and laughter of grief. This is a woman that her whole world's falling down. Her father is on the brink of death, can't even remember who she is. Her husband is dead. Her son could die at any moment, leading this grand army in open rebellion against the kingdoms. Bran and Rickon she hasn't seen for a long time. Sansa's a captive. Arya could be dead at this point. Think about that and put it into what Catelyn's experiencing with all these other people exploring, happiness and all that stuff. But this is interrupted as King Renly interrupts their conversation, inviting Catelyn for a walk to get some air. Brienne insists on coming with him for protection and all that stuff, but Renly reassures her, saying that he is safe within Lord Castle's castle, and that no sword is needed. Brienne is a bit hurt by this. Brienne wants to be with Renly all the time. She wants to be a knight and a soldier and all these things, not be eating at feasts and feeling uncomfortable, but her eyes then go downcast as she sits down. Renly takes Catelyn's arm and leads her out to the hall, passing a guardsman who straightens awkwardly, prompting Renly to make a jest. Again, Renly is someone that I do believe cares about his followers and things like that, and this man who is basically sleeping on the job, Renly doesn't, do what a lot of people might do and threaten him or punish him. He just shares a jest. And it's because Renly is surrounded by how many men? How would Renly die in the situation? It's Renly kind of not taking things seriously, but also you can also see, who's really going to attack Renly right now. Again, foreshadows his death. They move through a low door into a stair tower, and Renly asks if Catelyn had seen Sir Barristan or known anything about his whereabouts, wondering if he was with her son at Riverrun. Catelyn questions this, thinking that Barristan was still with Joffrey, and Renly explains that the Lannisters had idiotically dismissed him due to age and gave his position to the Hound. Renly shares that he had hoped to have Sir Barristan's sword, that he had kept a cloak for him, but when Sir Barristan did not appear at Highgarden, Renly thought he might have gone to Riverrun. Now, we know that this is not the case. Barristan is going to be currently heading towards Daenerys, but nobody else knows that. If you're a first-time reader, you would also be wondering, where is Barristan? Is he going to Robb? Is he going to Renly? Is he going to Stannis? Where is Barristan? Catelyn confirms they had not seen him and expresses concern for Sir Barristan's safety, agreeing with Renly that the Lannisters are foolish, which 100% they are. Cersei was dumb to make that move. As they continue to climb, Renly talks about the events of Book 1, about the night of Robert's death when he offered Ned 100 swords and urged him to take control of Joffrey and the kids, which could have avoided the need for Renly to claim the throne. Ned would have been regent. And we all know, I talked about this at length in book 1. I really covered that a lot, so if you want to hear my full thoughts on it, but it just didn't fit Ned's character. Even though the smart decision would have been to go with Renly and again, ally with him, it's not Ned's character. Ned, the entire story is about protecting children, protecting the innocent, taking them in the night and things like that. It's just not Ned's way. That'll get us into page 265. Renly acknowledges that Ned refused to support him because he had sworn to protect Robert's children, leaving Renly with no choice but to flee for his life, knowing the Queen would have killed him if he stayed, which Renly is very smart to do. He didn't have the power. If Ned was not going to back him, Renly did not have the power to stay. Catelyn bitterly thinks that if Renly had supported Ned, he might still be alive. That is not the case. If Renly had supported Ned, and they didn't do the coup at night, taking the kids, all that, taking control, and they had done the exact same thing Ned did, but just, okay, Renly had more men, I still think it's quite likely that Ned still would have been captured. They just didn't have the Gold Cloaks. The Gold Cloaks possessed more men than Renly and Ned did, and Renly understood that. But you can understand Catelyn's perspective as well. Catelyn's looking for any hope or someone to blame for Ned's death, and she's going to put a little bit of that blame on Renly. Renly expresses his respect for Ned, but notes he was too stubborn to bend or listen, which is true, right? Ned was not somebody willing to kind of play the Game of Thrones like characters like Renly, Littlefinger, or Varys. Renly leads Catelyn to the roof of the keep, where she sees a vast expanse of fire stretching across the land, comparing them to fallen stars with no end in sight, just showing the magnitude of Renly's camp that we've already talked about. Renly wonders how many fires burn around the entire camp, but Catelyn doesn't dare count, lost in her thoughts. Renly mentions that Robb had crossed the neck with 20,000 men, now possibly commanding 40,000, which we know is not the case whatsoever. Robb doesn't command nearly that amount of men, and Catelyn knows their numbers have dwindled due to battle losses and poor harvests. Again, the Riverlords have been kind of dispersed to defend their own lands. Robb's army is dwindling. Renly boasts that he has at least twice as many men as Robb, with more forces at Highgarden, a strong garrison at Storm's End, and soon the Dornishmen will join him. Now, this is a bold claim to suggest that the Dornishmen would back Renly, given the hatred between the Dornishmen, the Reach, and even the Baratheon regime. It's kind of up in the air. I think they'd probably join at the last second, kind of pull a Tywin type situation, but Renly has the right of it. Given the number game, Renly will win. But Renly is also holding out that Stannis will also back him, which is something that's very foolish. If you think Stannis is going to back you, Renly, given how Stannis is as a lawman, he's kind of not smart. But Catelyn sharply points out that Renly seems to have forgotten about him, that he won't do that whatsoever. Renly laughs and dismisses Stannis' claim, stating that Stannis would be a terrible king, and that while people respect him, few love him, which is the truth. People respect him as a military commander and all those things, but they don't love him. They don't want him to be king. They don't follow him out of love. They follow him out of, fear and respect. And those are things that Renly is going to use to his advantage to press his own claim. It really introduces Renly's thought process of why he should be king. Catelyn reminds Renly that Stannis is still his elder brother, and that if either of them has a right to the throne, it must be Stannis. And this doesn't really bother Renly. And it's really interesting. This is why I love about this, is us as an audience, we agree with Catelyn, right? If we go off of what Ned, basically found out that, yeah, okay, Myrcella, Tommen, and Joffrey are all Lannisters. Okay, then yes, Stannis is the next one in line, right? But then we get this challenged by Renly, and it really is something you have to sit back and think about here is, what is Renly's argument? Why does he believe he should be king? And Renly kind of shrugs this off. He says, what right did Robert ever have to the Iron Throne? And that's a great question. Because if you think about it, Robert did not have a claim to the Iron Throne. Yes, he had Targaryen lineage, down the depths of his whatever in his genes. But if you want to go off of who should have been the king next, it should have been Viserys. So, okay, Robert then, how did he take the throne? If he didn't have the right lineage, or if he didn't have the right blood, how did he become king? Well, he had the power. He took it by conquest, similar to Aegon's conquest, but then he added in a little wrinkle where I have Targaryen blood, I can take the throne. That's what Renly's whole argument's going to be. And so when we get into the last page of the chapter, page 266, That's what Renly says. Renly dismisses the significance of blood ties, such as the Baratheon Targaryen connection, stating that Robert won the throne with force, and that his claim was just as valid as any. Robert had the support of the people. The people wanted Robert to be king, and so he was. Renly has the largest army, the largest following. Why shouldn't he be king? He can claim that, one, he is descended from Robert, right? They have the same blood. He looks like him. And the people want him to be king because Stannis, in his mind, would be a horrible king. Renly's rationale, and given what we've seen in the past when people trying to become king and all that stuff, has an argument. If you want to think about it like this, in today's world, how do we, elect our leaders? We elect the leaders that we want to be in charge. Well, it's not necessarily as simple as that, but theoretically, if you're in the US, you're voting for a presidential election, you're voting for whoever you think is the better candidate. Not who came before them, not because of, their blood, but because of who you enjoy more. And so when you put it into a modern sense, Renly has a very interesting argument. Now, for you, your argument is to decide, do you think Renly is right to take the throne from his brother Stannis when the precedent would say Stannis is the rightful heir? Or is it on this idea that, again, do you think Renly would be a good king at all? Those are the things you kind of have to answer to think about Renly's claim. Renly then claims that if Robb supports him as Ned and Robert did all those years ago, he will generously confirm Robb's titles, lands, and honors, allowing him to rule Winterfell and even call himself king in the north so long as he swears fealty. So what Renly is really doing is he's given the Dornish terms, right? So the Dornish are still allowed to call themselves princes and princesses and all that stuff. He's giving the same idea here to the north. They can call themselves all they want, but they are still loyal to Renly. Catelyn questions what Renly would do if Robb refuses to give his fealty. And Renly firmly declares his intention to be king of not a broken kingdom, of all the kingdoms. He wants everything that Aegon had once taken over and then his ancestors and alliances with Dorne. He states that if Robb joins him, the war will essentially be over. And that's the case, right? Renly can win the war without Robb. Let's get that straight. Right? If Renly plays his cards right, he has more men, he can let Robb and Tywin battle it out and swing in and win at the end. He doesn't need Robb. But it makes it a lot easier if he has Robb. Renly references the wisdom of a Stark king kneeling to Aegon the Conqueror when 300 years Torrhen Stark had bent the knee to Aegon. Here's the difference. The North bent the knee to the dragons, not to men or to people, but to the dragons. And that's something that you got to think about if you're the North. And again, the thing that really ties down Robb's campaign, I've talked about this at length, is not the North itself of being independent. Robb being independent in the North makes a lot of sense. No Southern army can invade the North and control it. But the Riverlands, Catelyn's heritage, and the support of the Tullys is what screws Robb's kingdom, because he now is honor-bound to protect the Riverlands, something you can't do. You can't hold that against larger numbers. Renly says that Robb should follow that example, though, in bending the knee. Renly, though, is interrupted by the sound of chains, signaling the raising of the portcullis and a rider in a winged helm arriving from Storm's End. A message has reached them, one that will change the War of the Five Kings. The rider announces that Stannis is at the gates, calling himself King Stannis, and that Sir Courtney Penrose is defying him, but the situation is dire, as Stannis has put siege to his home, Storm's End. And that's how the chapter ends. That's a long chapter, one of the longest ones of the book. Catelyn's a great character, so I love to talk about her, and especially with Renly's whole arc and stuff like that. So I hope you guys all enjoyed the video. I got some new lighting for my birthday. I am recording this on my birthday, so I hope the lighting's a little bit better. I finally got some lights on this half of my face, so it doesn't look like this half is kind of in shadow. I also hope I kind of fixed for you guys how bright my face has been in some of the past videos. Just my monitor that I have that I've been using is very bright, and so I finally figured out how to turn it down and make it look hopefully a little bit better for you guys. But I hope you guys all enjoyed. This is one of my favorite chapters in the entire series, and I hope you guys all enjoyed it. Bye, guys.